Hello EDU 304 and welcome to day one of module 2 in our online learning experience. Okay, and so according to our online transition schedule, the addendum schedule I gave to you, this should be viewing for Wednesday, March 25th. This is day one of Rubric Construction. And your assignment as we work through this is to complete this document right here, which is the Perfect Cookie Rubric Graphic Organizer. And then as we're working through this, once you complete it, go ahead and just upload it under coursework on my USF, and that will be your attendance grade for your participation today. So let's go ahead and as you are completing that, let's go ahead and begin our first foray into rubric construction and design. Here are the two questions that I have driving the lesson today, and it might sound kind of strange, but the first question is, what makes a perfect cookie? Like a cookie, like a chocolate chip cookie that if we were meeting face to face, I would have warm and waiting for you down in the library classroom. And then secondly, how do you know? Because how do you ensure that your idea of a perfect cookie is equal to other classmates' ideas, my own idea, other people's idea of what makes a perfect cookie? And you could naturally extend this question and delete cookie and insert any sort of content area that you're teaching and ask yourself, what makes this assignment perfect? And then how do I know? How do my students know? How do parents know? Administrators know? And so on and so forth. So those are the driving questions we're going to get to. I also note that you should be sure to upload your Perfect Cookie Rubric Graphic Organizer for attendance today. The objective for today's lesson is for you to identify and also to demonstrate your ability to use the three essential components of rubric design. Let's begin with what is a rubric. A rubric is a type of scoring guide that is used to assess a student's performance based on the sum of a full range of criteria, rather than a single numerical score. So I want you to contrast the idea of using a rubric with the idea of giving a student back a completed assignment, a paper perhaps, where you simply have one numerical score at the top, 95%. And then sometimes maybe a symbol associated with that. In the case of a 95%, that symbol would most likely be A. But I want you to think about that on the one hand and a rubric on the other hand, because a rubric is also giving that student insight to their level of performance. If it's a 95 and it's an A, then it's a pretty darn good performance. But it's not just based on a single numerical score or a single symbol like an A or an A minus, but on the sum of a full range of different criteria that you are making explicitly known to your students. So then why would we use a rubric? Well, in the case of authentic assessments, real-life types of learning experiences, or performance tasks, things that you're asking students to perform or do, maybe debate or maybe recite something or play in a musical performance. Those types of tasks are most successful when students clearly know what is expected of them before they engage in the activity. Note that, before they engage in the activity. It should never be the case that a student goes about their business and begins completing an assignment without knowing exactly what criteria or which criteria they're going to be assessed on. So we want to communicate that information to students prior to engaging in the activity. Additionally, I note that rubrics clarify the standards and objectives and create a less subjective grading experience for teachers. Now, this is important because we want to, the best of our ability, ensure that an A in my class is the same as an A in my next door neighbor's class who teaches the exact same grade, the exact same content as me, rather than allowing my subjective biases to impact my grading approach. Rubrics contain three essential components, and for this example today, I'm going to use what's referred to as an analytical rubric. We'll discuss in day 2 various forms of rubrics, but let's just stick to the analytic one. I'm assuming most of you have seen a rubric of this sort in some kind of context before. I could be wrong, and if that's the case, we're going to go through every element anyways, but this is the type of rubric that I'm envisioning. And those three essential components are categories, scores, and performance descriptors. Let's go ahead and get into them. Where do we find our categories? Our categories are typically listed along the left-hand side, and these are the various categories that we are assessing, evaluating, judging, right? So these could be standards that we are expecting students to meet. These are the various things that we are judging in any sort of performance or project-based assessment. Second are the scores. You can see up at the top that our scores move in a numerical value, either increasing or decreasing. I prefer this where we begin with the highest, so you see the 4 level right next to the categories, and then move to the 3, to the 2, to the 1, and so on. And my rationale for that is I want students to look at the category, look at the component, and then right away look at the highest score, which in this scenario is a 4, because that's what I want their goal to be. Now, there are great instructors that begin with the 1 and they move up to the 4 or the 5 or the 6 or whatever it is, and their rationale is they want students to be able to see what elements are added as they move up in the score. Either way is fine, whether you begin with the 1 or you begin with the 4. My preference will always be to begin with the highest number. Now you also see here that in terms of the score, I only have 4. This is probably the most common format of rubric, but you could certainly have 5, you might even have 6, in some cases you might have 3. What I like about the 4 level of score is typically that 3 range correlates to proficiency. That's what we expect students to do. The 2 signifies we're just slightly below proficiency. The 1 is labeled oftentimes as beginning, in need of drastic improvement, and the 4 would be exceeding expectations. So it's a nice, easy way, standards-based wise, of just sort of dividing the various levels of performance descriptors. Speaking of those, that's what comes next. All of the remaining boxes would be detailed descriptors outlining what students need to do for each category in order to earn a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1. And so whatever that category is, we want to clearly articulate this is what needs to be shown, accomplished, displayed, demonstrated in order to earn a 4, so that students are clear. And so that we as instructors are clear when we go about our grading as well. Rubrics are not used, just to clarify for you, for any sort of forced or closed response type question. What I mean by that is a multiple choice or a true and false situation where the number of responses are closed, they're limited. Students are forced to make one choice over the other. And so multiple choice and true and false would certainly be examples of those. And I would argue that matching and short answer would also be examples of forced closed choice responses, in which case rubrics would not be appropriate. Rubrics would be appropriate to use for any sort of authentic, real-life, project-based, or performance task, such as products, performances, extended written responses, oral presentations, essays, artwork, science fair projects, research projects, musical performances, literary analyses that do not have an answer key. So any sort of assessment where I'm asking students to create and perform and demonstrate something that goes beyond a simple true and false, multiple choice, fill in the blank type of response, where I'm not using an answer key. A rubric would then be an appropriate tool to assess student learning. So as we get into the how of rubric design, what I'd like to do for the sake of clarity is to divide our rubric design into 5 steps. The first step is to determine the learning outcomes. In class, I'm fond of saying you want to begin your planning with the end in mind. So I always want to begin my lesson planning, my unit planning, and this would include rubric planning. I want to begin by thinking about the end point, the outcomes that I'm expecting for students. What are the learning outcomes? What are the concepts or the skills or the performance standards that I'm assessing? And once I determine those learning outcomes, those become the categories that I put, or the components that I put on the left-hand side of my rubric. So you can see in this example, this rubric is for what I imagine is a persuasive writing assignment. I suppose it could also be persuasive speaking, but you see that the components that are important in this rubric are that there's some level of organization, right? There's an introduction, and then students provide reasons, textual evidence to back up whatever claim they're stating, and then they draw some form of conclusion. They also note that there needs to be structure, and they need to use transitions and spelling and grammar. Okay, well that indicates it's certainly a writing assignment, right? But those are the outcomes that I'm expecting from my students. So those then become the components or the categories that I'm using and I'm going to be assessing students on throughout. So our first step will be to determine if we're going to create a rubric, and this is what I'd like to do today, is to create a rubric to assess the quality of chocolate chip cookies. Now you have that rubric right in front of you, and you can certainly fill this in any way that you choose. You don't have to necessarily follow my components and my criteria and my performance descriptors. But if you'd like to, if you just like to mirror what I'm doing, that's perfectly fine for today. This is the gradual release of responsibility. So today I'm going to do this with you, and then I'm going to kind of cut you loose to sort of do it on your own in a future lesson on rubrics, okay? So if we're going to create a rubric to assess the quality of chocolate chip cookies, what we have to determine is what are our performance standards? What learning outcomes should we include? And if you'd like to, you can certainly pause this video right here and go ahead and begin brainstorming those and then writing those down as rubric components. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and just continue forward. As I think about the elements that are important for me in a quality chocolate chip cookie, the first would be the number of chocolate chip cookies, or the number of chocolate chips, excuse me. I don't want a bite that has too few. I probably don't want a bite that has too many either. What's the texture of the cookie overall? What does it feel like in my hand, in my mouth? What's the color visually? Is it appealing to me? What does it taste like? What's the quality of the taste? And then, of course, warmth, right? Because a fresh cookie is the best cookie. So if I were to take those outcomes and then create from that those components or measurable criteria, my next step would be to determine how many points I'm going to be used to score student work. Maybe I want this to be out of 4 points, maybe out of 5 points, maybe a range of 6 points. And like I said, I like to begin with the desired performance. So in this example, I'm going to make my scoring criteria out of 4 points, and I'm going to begin with the best cookie, which would be the 4. I need to next determine the description for each score. What language am I going to use to let students know and to remind myself what constitutes a score of 4, a score of 3, and a score of 2 or 1 for each of those criteria or components that I've determined. And I want to preferably make this in student-friendly language, because the first and foremost goal of this rubric is to give this to students before they begin the project so that they are clear about what the goal or what the target is. So let's just assume we're in a home economics type of class and the goal is for students to create the best darn cookie that they can according to my qualifications, all right, which I'm going to make clear on this rubric. For a 4, I would say these are delicious cookies, right? These are like grandma's home-baked, fresh, hot out of the oven cookies. A 3 is a good cookie. This is a bakery quality cookie. This is a high quality cookie. This is everything that I expect from a cookie. It might not be as warm or as fresh. It's like something that I might buy from the bakery. A 2 would be a cookie that could use a little bit of improvement, right? This is a cookie that was maybe that frozen dough you buy from Hy-Vee. It had some taste of preservatives in it. Maybe not all of the cookies were equal in there, and so some were burnt and they're crispy and some are not fully baked. And a number 1 would be a poor cookie. This would be an old cookie, a stale cookie. Maybe think about those cookies that are available in the USF cafeteria that have been sitting out throughout the entire lunch period. Now, maybe you like those cookies. I don't know. Again, I'm choosing the criteria for this one. And those are the criteria, the scoring criteria that I might use. Step 2 is for me to determine those measurable criteria then. And so I have to determine what makes a 4-level cookie? What makes a delicious cookie? So when I think about those criteria, I said the number of chocolate chips. Well, a delicious cookie is going to have chocolate chips in every single bite. Okay? I talked about the texture of the cookie. A 4-level delicious cookie is going to be chewy. I talked about the coloring of the cookie. A 4-level, highest level delicious cookie is going to be golden brown, baked in the oven but not burnt, right? I talked about the taste quality of the cookie, and a number 4 is going to have that home-baked taste, okay? And also a rich and creamy flavor. So this is my 4. This is the goal that students are reaching for. But I also have to communicate, if they're going to lose points, how and why they might lose those points. So let's move down to the 3. In terms of the number of chocolate chips in a good cookie versus a delicious cookie, is there might only be chocolate chips in 75% of the bites. It might be chewy in the middle but crispy along the edges. It might be brown from overcooking or light from undercooking. And the taste might be a quality taste, but more of a store-bought type of taste. So you see, I'm providing various performance descriptors to allow students to understand the difference in each criteria between a delicious cookie and a good cookie. As I move down a little bit further to a cookie that needs improvement, I see again the number of chocolate chips decreases. I see more description about the texture of the cookie and the coloring and the taste of the cookie. And I move further down into the poor category. So what I'm able to do is clearly articulate to students what the goal is and then where in reality, when I taste their cookie, they land on this rubric. As we think about determining measurable criteria, it's oftentimes helpful to use concept words that convey various degrees of performance. So as I'm moving from a 4 down to a 3 to a 2 to a 1, it's sometimes helpful to envision like a cheeseburger, right? And so here at the 4, we have everything that we could imagine or we desire in our burger. We have the lettuce, we have the cheese, the tomatoes, the burger, the patty, everything, right? And as we move down, we're losing essential pieces of that burger. So some of the ways that we might format our language is from the presence of something to the absence of something. Think like the chocolate chips, right? The presence of chocolate chips in every bite down to the absence of some chocolate chips. It might be helpful to categorize this on a spectrum from something that's complete to incomplete. Many of something to some to none of something. From a piece that's a major component to something that's a minor component. From a student consistently demonstrating an ability to do something down to inconsistency in their ability to demonstrate. Or in a student's frequency of using or doing or including something. Always doing something to generally to sometimes to rarely. Step 3 in rubric construction then asks us to develop a grid so that we're able to kind of put all of these components in a nice, easy to read, structured format. And with this grid, we begin by inserting our categories or our components or criteria, whatever we want to call those, over on the left-hand side. Here we have the number of chips, the texture, the color, the taste, the richness. From there, we want to go ahead and insert our scores along the top. Here we have our range working from 4, which is the ideal, that's the goal, down to 3, down to 2, down to 1. And then we insert those performance descriptors. So we're able to judge and assess and evaluate which of these criteria students have met at which level of performance. Step 4 asks us to then actually assess our students' work. And what we're able to do with rubrics is we're able to clearly articulate in which criteria areas students were successful. So you see in the area of texture that this student scored a 4. They were above the expected level of proficiency in this particular category. Doesn't mean everything was a 4, doesn't mean everything was an A+, but this particular category was awarded that score. Many of the other categories then fit into the 3 range, the proficiency range of a good cookie. And then we see one area that's in need of improvement, and that is the criteria of taste. What this then allows us as instructors to do is to give students really reliable and helpful feedback in terms of areas that they did well and areas that they were a little bit weaker in, and that they could work to improve in days and weeks to come. So step 5 then is to provide our students with feedback. And a few things we want to keep in mind in terms of how we're providing students with feedback is we want to certainly make all of these criteria clear before we begin the project. But then we also want to give students a completed copy of the rubric at the end of the project so that they're able to see visually where they met the mark and where they may have fallen short. We're going to want to provide comments to support our grading choices. Okay? What's helpful about a rubric is that it's not a mystery to me when mom or dad come into conferences 2 months later and ask why little Johnny or little Susie or little whoever scored 2.5 on the cookie unit. I'm able to pull out that rubric and I'm able to read comments that I wrote and I'm able to look at the areas that I circled and I'm able to explain to them these are the criteria that the student met and these are the criteria that they did not meet. I certainly want to provide a verbal or a written explanation to my students in any area that I've scored them low on or below proficiency. This could be in the form of just a one-on-one conference or meeting or conversation. It could be in the form of written comments for students maybe in high school or the older grades that I include on that rubric. But I want to make sure that students understand why they fell short. I don't so much need to maybe provide all of that information if they exceeded my expectations, but in areas where I'm expecting them to improve the next time or to redo some work and show that improvement, I want to be very clear in articulating what my expectations were and how they did not meet those. And then finally, as I alluded to in the previous comment, we want to provide students with an opportunity to demonstrate improvement and growth. This shouldn't be a one and done sort of deal, where if they fail or if there are areas that they are below proficiency in, they never have an opportunity to grow. Okay, the name of the game in education is for students to grow. And so any area and any student that is below performance expectations needs to be provided an opportunity to grow and to demonstrate their growth. All right, that is all I have for you today for day one of our rubric design. As a reminder, I ask that you would complete the Perfect Cookie Rubric Graphic Organizer and then upload that or take a picture and upload it to my USF in order to receive attendance credit for today. Thanks a lot, and I will see you for Rubrics Day 2 tomorrow.